Okay, I'm told that we are good. I really appreciate being here at the SNPE conference, SNPE and the Colorado Star Party. I thank Carrie King for inviting me. Could we have a little round of applause? I really think that's appropriate. Yeah, because I have not been here before. I wasn't here for 1 or 2. This is 3, correct? And I am just really super impressed. I mean, Carrie had to talk me into coming, and now I understand why I'm here, and I really appreciate it. I am representing one of the themes of SNPE this year, and that is the concept of ancient civilizations, but not just any old ancient civilizations, but extremely old. The concept that ancient civilization goes back to an extremely remote period, essentially 6,000 years before my academic colleagues think traditionally, according to their dogma, when civilization began. So my name is Robert Schoch, and I am a Boston University faculty member. I have been there since 1984. I received my PhD in geology and geophysics in 1983 from Yale University. This just gives you a little bit of why I'm in this, why I'm going to be talking about what I'm talking about. And I've always loved ancient civilizations, but I did not go and get a degree in I got a degree in anthropology as an undergraduate. I got a degree in geology as an undergraduate, but then I went on in geology and geophysics. I did not plan to start studying ancient civilizations, but as I'll talk about in a few minutes, I fell back into it in 1990 with John Anthony West, when I first got involved with this with John Anthony West. Has anyone heard of him before? Yeah. So that's part of the story. But what I want to talk about today, and the title for this presentation is The Great Sphinx and the Legacy of Zep Tepi. So if you've not heard of Zep Tepi is one of many terms in the ancient world from different cultures, different civilizations. When I say the ancient world, there's 2 different ancient worlds. One is the ancient world that most people think of, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, more or less what I now call the most recent cycle of civilization. But all of the ancient traditions from that time period, approximately, let's say 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, talked about an earlier cycle of civilization. That's my term, cycle of civilization, but earlier period, an earlier civilization that they inherited knowledge from, that they even inherited physical structures from. This has been considered nonsense by most of my academic colleagues. And I want to say that I used to think that also many years ago, 40 plus years ago, being indoctrinated in the standard school of thinking, but we have to follow the evidence. And my guiding principle is to always follow the evidence, whether I like it or not, whether my academic colleagues like it or not. You follow the evidence, and you follow the evidence wherever it may lead, no matter how, quote, unlikely it is, or how, I don't like the term common sense. Why? Because common sense probably is not very logical in most cases. It's just the established dogma of the time. Do you follow what I'm saying? So you follow it logically. So Zep Tepi, in ancient Egyptian, it means essentially the first time. When I say ancient Egyptian, let's think 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, the first time, the time of creation, the beginning of, for them, civilization, a golden age, when the gods lived among the humans. And I am going to ask the question, which I've asked in my research, is there any reality to the concept of Zep Tepi? What's another concept of an early cycle of civilization? Plato. Atlantis. Where did Plato get Atlantis from? Solon. Where did he get it from? Egypt. So the same concept. So Zep Tepi in the ancient Egyptian essentially means time, Zep, and the first. Tepi the first time. As I said, interestingly, certain Egyptologists, in fact, one who's very, very prominent, and I won't name his name, but you might guess who he is, even denied recently that Zep Tepi is an ancient Egyptian concept. He said, oh, it's just a New Age fabrication, a New Age myth. Not at all. I just want to point out that we have, for instance, the pyramid texts that go back to the 4th millennium BCE. They talk about this early period. They talk about Zep Tepi. So they're talking about, there's no question, 4,000 plus years ago, you have people like Diodorus Siculo or Diodorus from Sicily, who was a historian in the 1st century BCE. He recorded that the ancient Egyptians in his time thought that there was an earlier cycle of civilization. Here's a quote from him, of course, translated into English. Some of them, that is the priests of Egypt, give the story that at first gods and heroes ruled Egypt for a little less than 18,000 years. The last of the gods to rule being Horus, the son of Isis, and mortals have been kings over their country, they say, for a little less than 5,000 years. This is in the 1st century BCE, so even the 5,000 years is older than the classic modern tradition of Egyptology. And you've heard of the dynasties of Egypt? A lot of people mistakenly think, oh, the ancient Egyptians thought in terms of dynasties. Not at all. That's something that Manetho first established in Ptolemaic Egypt. He was one of the high priests and historians in the 3rd century BCE. So even that concept is actually very modern, but Zep Tepi goes back thousands of years, the very concept. So I first got involved with this type of thing with John Anthony West. This is John Anthony West on the right and me on the left when he was still alive. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2018, and he brought me in initially to work on the redating of the Sphinx. So to make a long story short, he had been working in Egypt. He had become fascinated with ancient Egypt, and he had translated for his own work, not for publication, the work of R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, who died back in about 1961 or so. And he was basically, the Egyptologists wouldn't want to call him an Egyptologist, but he was sort of a mathematician, philosopher, alchemist, very knowledgeable about Egypt, had spent years and years studying the Egyptian temples, and among other things, came to the conclusion that yes, the ancient Egyptian civilization was much more advanced, much more sophisticated scientifically and mathematically than anyone gave them credit for in modern times, plus it went back to a much earlier period. And Schwaller had noticed that there was a weird erosion on the Sphinx that doesn't appear elsewhere on the monuments of the Giza Plateau. So being a geologist and a geophysicist, through a colleague at Boston University, I met John Anthony West, and he invited me to go to Egypt. I first went there in 1990, specifically to study the geology of the Sphinx. And I thought that I was really taking advantage of this poor man because he was flying me to Egypt. I wasn't being paid, but I got a free ride to Egypt, and I was going to get to see Egypt, which I'd never really thought about one way or another seeing it. And I was going to take advantage of him because within seconds, I should be able to tell him why he's wrong and why the Sphinx is the standard dating that all the Egyptologists believe. Because why would my academic colleagues be so far off? Turns out that was not how it worked. So I went first to Egypt in 1990 and there to study the Sphinx. Just to give you a little background, at the time, and this ties in with civilization as a whole, the origins of civilization, there was a paradigm. There still is a paradigm that is held by many, many people in academic community and elsewhere, and that paradigm was really espoused and sort of put into its modern form by a man named V. Gordon Childe, who died in 1957. And that standard paradigm is that there are fundamental stages of humanity, evolutionary stages of humanity. Originally, we were savagery, we were hunters, gatherers, foragers. Then we sort of developed into barbarism. What's barbarism in a technical sense? Early cultivation, early agriculture. This is sometimes referred to as the Neolithic Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution. It turns out V. Gordon Childe was a bit of a Marxist. Not that I, just the way it was. That was a popular concept at that time. Why? This is actually interesting relative, I think, to a lot of us here, including myself. Marxism, especially in the first half of the 20th century, was very what? Materialistic. And I remember having anthropology professors where everything was material. Everything was material. If there was any glimmerings of religion, it was just to control the masses in a material way. Am I making sense? Yeah, so forget about spirituality. Oh, that's just all nonsense. I don't agree with that view. And civilization eventually graduates to, humanity eventually graduates to civilization where you have settlements, you have cities, you have high culture, you have monumental architecture. And what's important for our story today, for our analysis today, is that according to the standard paradigm, we don't have civilization anywhere on Earth until about 4,000 to 3,000 BCE. So think in terms of 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, first in Mesopotamia and Egypt, little later in China, much later in the New World in this part of the, North and South America and Mesoamerica. So this was the standard paradigm I went with. I had no reason to question it back in 1990. That rise of civilization is about 3,500 BCE, and the Sphinx is about 2,500 BCE. Period. End of story. Has no earlier origins. It was just carved de novo from scratch in 2,500 BCE, and I was going to prove West wrong and get the free trip to Egypt. And of course, I knew, at that time, I really didn't know about Zep Tepi so much, but I knew about Plato and the world ages and the concept of Atlantis. But at that time, I was still thinking as a standard, indoctrinated young academic that this was all nonsense. The only good about Plato was his philosophical view, certainly not his historical perspective. So I go to Egypt, and everything sort of fell apart, and the paradigm cracked for me when I first went to Egypt in 1990, and that literally happened very, very quickly. So we went together, as I mentioned, John Anthony West, and this is John Anthony West and myself, at the Great Sphinx. This is much later. This is not early 1990s. This is 2016, actually 2 years before he passed away. But he had been searching for open-minded geologists, and I was not the only person he asked, or even the first person, certainly not the first person. People had been turning him down left and right because geologists, and this is what I learned later, did not want to get involved in some kind of argument over archaeology and the Sphinx and that type of thing. But I did. I was naive, young faculty member at the time. So I went to the Great Pyramids. Here you can see, if you've not been there, this is the Great Pyramid, the second pyramid, and then down in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the third pyramid, and you see the Sphinx circled? And actually, as a side note, if you look at that, you can see that the Great Pyramid actually has 8 sides. Each side is very slightly indented, in just the right light you can see it. Do people see that? Sort of curious. There's lots of curiosities on the Giza Plateau, but they only gave me an hour and a half today and an hour and a half tomorrow to talk, so. So the Sphinx is located in the Giza Plateau. It's due east of the second pyramid, also known as the Khafre pyramid or the Chephren pyramid, after the pharaoh Khafre, who supposedly built that pyramid and supposedly carved the Sphinx. I say supposedly, the suppose it is the standard Egyptological view. It sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert. It is carved from the limestone. If you haven't been there, many people think that the Sphinx is sitting up in majesty and you sort of look up at the Sphinx. No, when you go there, you actually walk around what looks like a pit. It's called the Sphinx pit or Sphinx enclosure, and you look down at the body and you're sort of at level with the head, because the head originally was an outcrop that stood above the plateau, the level of the plateau. They carved the head, then they had to cut down into the rock to carve the body. So this is actually very important to me geologically, and within 90 seconds, I'm not exaggerating, I realized that there was something amiss with the standard dating of the Great Sphinx. So there was something wrong because it sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert. As I was mentioning, then they carved the body. They had to cut down into the bedrock. Now, it's also interesting, and a lot of people don't realize this, or they don't put enough emphasis on it, even if they do. When they carved the body of the Sphinx, they didn't just use, pickaxes or whatever and make a bunch of rubble that they could pull out with baskets. That would be pretty easy. No, they carved huge multi-ton blocks, which they then moved to in front of the Sphinx and to, as you face the Sphinx to the left, to build what's now known as the Sphinx Temple and Valley Temples. So those temples made out of these huge multi-ton blocks are actually as old as the origins of the Sphinx. A lot of people don't realize that. So we're not just talking carving something out of bedrock, we're also talking about construction, megalithic construction at this early period. And I'll get to how early that is in a minute. This is a view, just to give you a sense of it, if you haven't been there, the Sphinx in front of the second pyramid. And what you see in front of the Sphinx is the Sphinx Temple. All of those blocks were taken out when the body was carved. And to the left is the Valley Temple, also carved from limestone blocks. This is just a few views to give you a sense. Do you see the person in the picture there for scale? Here's John Anthony West, and actually one of my former students, measuring some of the blocks. You can see how huge these blocks are. These blocks, I guarantee you, weighed a lot more than a lot of the trailers and vehicles out here. I mean, some of them weighed as much as a loaded, what do you call it, a railroad car, and just a few more views, and here just to look at it. And what I focused on was the weathering and erosion when I first got there. And this is really what gives it away. And what I saw in the first 90 seconds, one of two major observations. The core body and the enclosing walls of the enclosure of the Sphinx do not show wind and sand and desert erosion and weathering. They have very evident, and this is what my academic colleagues in geology have said to me when I presented this first to them. This is Geology 101. They have water precipitation, weathering, and erosion. And in the diagram on the bottom left, that's a diagram, you can see how water running over the rocks will give a rounded rolling profile, and it will also carve out of the limestone fissures, vertical fissures. Everyone see what I'm talking about? You don't get this with wind and sand. Here's another, just a close-up of that, just to show you the scale of these. This is younger me. I don't know if you'd recognize me in that. And I am showing one of these fissures. And it's very interesting. If you look at the top, sort of above my head and slightly to the right, do you see how the fissure actually made a little vertical tunnel? And the water seep through? There's no way you get that from flowing sand or other aspects. That is water coming from above. Here's older me at that fissure. You can't see that fissure anymore. Why? Because it's been blocked up and cemented up by the modern Egyptians. Why? Oh, it was deteriorating. Some people have suggested it was blocked up for other reasons. But they would never cover up evidence, would they? Not purposefully. Anyway, and in fact, you see above my head, sort of slightly to the right, what I'm talking about? There's literally just classic from precipitation. Some more views. Here's younger me looking at that just to show you. And this contrasts with wind erosion. So this is limestones. It's like a layer cake where you have harder layers and softer layers. And both wind erosion and rain erosion, it's the softer layers that weather out and erode more easily. But the wind gives a very different pattern. What you get is a desert varnish on the harder surfaces of the wind with the wind erosion, and then it scours out or makes sort of a wind tunnel. That's a diagram, of course, but here is younger me looking at some real wind erosion. And here we are looking, when I say here, this is John Anthony West and myself. This is actually, the upper right is from the early 1990s, looking at one of the fissures with the rain erosion, and then here's some of the wind erosion. Can you start to see the difference? It's very evident once you see it. Even young children can see the difference and identify it correctly. So here we have the rain erosion, the wind erosion. And I want to point out, I'm going to go back for a second, that this site where I'm showing the classic wind erosion, it is only a few hundred meters from the Sphinx. It is easy walking distance. A stone's throw, as they say, and easy walking distance to a geologist means that you can walk out the rocks. You can walk out the strata, as we say, and it's exactly the same rock. Zahi Hawass, have you heard of him? Okay, true story. He once tried to argue, oh no, it's different rock, that's why it's weathering differently. Well, even if it were different lithologies, it would not be weathering to look like wind in one case and water and rainfall in the other case. So that's a little difficult to buy. But given that's the same rock, the same lithology, it's really impossible to argue that. So he got a couple of Cairo University geologists to come and look at it and say, well, I'm wrong, Schoch is wrong. No, they said, actually, he's right. No one ever heard from them again. So anyway, I initially pushed the origins of the Sphinx back to an earlier period because the Sahara Desert, incredibly, is a relatively recent desert. It's about 5,000 or so years old by the most conservative dates. And back then, when I say back then, early 1990s, I was being relatively conservative. This was the one mistake I regret in hindsight. I initially dated the core body of the Sphinx to about 5,000 to 7,000 BCE, somewhere in that range. So, so maybe 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. Just so you'll know where I stand now, I now put it before the end of the last ice age, circa 10,000 or so BCE. End of the last ice age was 9,700 BCE. We have very good data for that. I'm going to come to this, but I want to mention it now. The second thing I noticed in the first 90 seconds, I'm not exaggerating, when I first saw the Sphinx in 1990, was not only is the erosion and weathering incompatible with the Sahara Desert conditions, but secondly, the head is too small for the body, much too small. It is not the original head. I've had Egyptologists say to me many times, oh, it's a dynastic head. Yeah, I know it's a dynastic head. It's not the original head. Just some other, there's lots of lines of evidence. I won't even go through all of them today, but you have at the Saqqara, which is a site not far from Giza. That's the site where, if you know anything about Egypt, that's where the famous step pyramid is of Djoser. And there you have, for instance, mud brick mastabas, tombs. And they have been well dated by Egyptologists and radiocarbon dated to 2,800 and earlier BCE. The traditional date for the Sphinx is 2,500 BCE. If there was enough rain and whatnot, 2,500 BCE and post that time to do what we see on the Sphinx with the erosion and weathering, these mud brick mastabas, which are presumably 300 years older than the traditional date for the Sphinx, they would be what? Absolutely gone, absolutely gone. They're just dried mud brick. They're not fired or anything else. Another thing is, when you look at the Sphinx, that's the rump of the Sphinx on the right side. Do you see in the back corner of the Sphinx enclosure, there's this gully? That is an ancient gully. It's filled in with Old Kingdom, according to Egyptologists I've spoken to, with Old Kingdom blocks and whatnot. Well, why would you have a gully there if it's been Sahara conditions? If the Sphinx is only 2500 BCE, quite evidently water was running down back into that corner. It turns out when you look at the plateau and you look at the paleohydrology, and I've talked to other two paleohydrologists about this, ancient Egypt with the plateau, before it was modified with these silly big lumps called pyramids, the water flowed basically from the north to the south, slightly east, more or less from around the area of the Great Pyramid down to the Sphinx. I'm going to try walk over here for just a second. So can people see what I'm looking at? This is the Great Pyramid, and the water flowed this way towards the Sphinx. Everyone with me? That's a natural slope. That's a natural edge. Or the natural paleohydrology of the plateau. The water would flow this way. This is the Sphinx. And it would go over these walls, and that corner in particular would catch a lot, which is why you have that gully. So the Sphinx is supposed to be 2500 BCE and goes with the second pyramid. End of story. The Great Pyramid was built before the Sphinx, according to my traditional Egyptological academic friends, well, friends in quotes. It turns out, though, by their own work, and this is from Mark Lehner in particular, this one, do you see where it says worked by Khufu? Do you see that northern quarry? Once you build the northern quarry, it stops that flow of water. The northern quarry was quarried to supply limestone for the Great Pyramid. Everyone follow me? So this, as one of my paleohydrologist friends said to me, demonstrates definitively that the Sphinx has to be older than the Great Pyramid, not vice versa, because you've changed the hydrology once you've got that quarry. And then the question is, how much older? Well, then that gets into the paleoclimatology, et cetera, et cetera. So the quarry would stop that flow of water. And, really, at least according to this analysis, this definitive proof, it has to be older, and that in itself upsets the Egyptologists. Now let's get to how much older. Other silly things, and I don't mean that, I just am using that colloquially. I don't mean in I'm not trying to make fun of people, put it that way, but the quarry would stop the flow of water. I started to say other silly things. One of my, a colleague, I use the term colleague loosely, another academic suggested that yes, there is ancient erosion on the body of the Sphinx. But why? Yes, it's incredibly ancient. It goes back to a much earlier period because the Sphinx was originally a yardang, a natural weathered stone structure that started to sort of look like a Sphinx. And this is his illustration. I won't name his name because I don't want to embarrass people too much. But then this ancient Egyptians, 2500 BC, said, that sort of looks like a Sphinx. We'll just touch it up and turn it into a Sphinx. It sounds like a good theory, right, if you've never been there? And you don't know what it looks like? Well, at least he thought it sounded like a good theory. He's Egyptian, too. But he had moved away from Egypt. The problem is, remember, the Sphinx was carved. The body had to be carved down into the bedrock. You don't get this type of feature carved down into the bedrock. And if it was correct that this was just natural weathering and erosion, I would actually prefer it because that would be an incredible new form of geological phenomenon where rain and wind and sand and whatnot could carve out huge blocks, move them, and re-erect them into a temple. Now, wouldn't that be great? Yeah, as a geologist, that appeals to me. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. I've also had the chance to look at the Sphinx up close, and something that's another line of evidence is the repairs. So there's younger me with, I think, a very sunburnt hand, and my hand is on modern repairs, literally modern repairs. I was watching them put some of these repairs in, but under my hand, do you see how there's older blocks? Do you see those? Zahi was, among other people, protector of the status quo, has told me that those blocks are Old Kingdom repairs. The question is, if they're Old Kingdom repairs, how could it be that the Sphinx was carved in the Old Kingdom? And essentially his answer is that, it was made out of very rotten rock, and it eroded away over a meter, over 3 feet, and then they had to repair it within a couple of 100 years. No, it doesn't make sense geologically. So just lots of lines of evidence. Another thing that I want to mention is this is actually the Valley Temple, so-called Valley Temple. Can you see the little person there? That's actually John Anthony West for scale. But in the Valley Temple, we have the temple. It's dedicated to the Sphinx, and then the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple. And these temples are really strange, weird temples because they are made of huge megalithic blocks of limestone, which then are coated with not quite as huge, but still really huge blocks of granite, Aswan granite brought from deep south, from Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt is, of course, south in Egypt, and Lower Egypt is to the north because this Nile runs from south to north. They brought in these huge blocks of granite to face the limestone that the temples are made out of. Why would they do this? My answer is that these limestone temples, remember, they were originated from the time of the Sphinx. When the Sphinx was first carved, they were very weathered and eroded, and you can see that to this day. If you look at the left-hand side and you look at it carefully, the limestone was weathered and eroded by precipitation. The granite was actually carved to marry or fit to it as to protect it. What are they doing? They're protecting, I think, a very sacred ancient structure. When we have things that we want to protect today, what do? We maybe do plexiglass over them, that type of thing. They're putting a granite coating over them. And they even carved into it. Can you see that? It's very eroded. But the right side, do you see the hieroglyphics? The Egyptologists, numerous, have published and asserted those are absolutely Old Kingdom hieroglyphics, but the evidence is geologically quite, I would say, undoubted that though that granite was added well later than the limestone. So if those are Old Kingdom inscriptions on the granite, the limestone must be much older. Everyone follow? Plus, do we know that those inscriptions were put there when the granite was first put there, or could they have even been put in later? We just don't know. But they did use granite quite a bit to restore, refurbish ancient structures. Just a few other things, as I think these are interesting. Why was the weathering and erosion from pre-Sahara times so well preserved? Fortunately for us, the Sphinx was carved down into the bedrock, and it fills with sand very, very quickly. And this is acted to protect it. This is, I just like these. This is from the early 1600s, and they're going to see the pyramids. You see the pyramids there, and you see the Sphinx. How much of the Sphinx do you see? Just the head sticking out of the sand. Here's one from the early 19th century, where again, it's basically the head and part of the shoulder sticking out. Likewise here and here. So it fills up with sand very, very quickly. I wanted to have more evidence to bear on the age of the Sphinx. So something that we did was we did subsurface seismic testing. Subsurface seismic work, I did this with my colleague at the time, So this is early 1990s again. Dr. Thomas Debicki, he's the one that seeded. I'm a geologist and geophysicist. He's a geophysicist. We used a sledgehammer, as you see there. We pounded on a steel plate. We put seismic waves, basically sound waves or energy waves, into the ground, and they bounce off the different layers of rock, the different hardnesses, thicknesses of rock. So we did this, just some shots of us doing that. There's John Anthony West and Thomas Debicki, and there I am. And what we found, which is what I actually anticipated from looking at surface features, is that the subsurface weathering, it's not erosion, it's simply mineralogical changes that occur once you expose the surface of the limestone. So once the surface of the limestone bedrock, the floor of the Sphinx enclosure was exposed, it starts to weather. It starts to undergo mineralogical changes. And the deeper the weathering, the older it is. Everyone follow? I mean, it's a very standard technique that is used now. They actually use it sometimes on little teeny artifacts, and they look at weathering rinds that are only on the size of millimeters, but you can do it on a large scale too. What we found is that the weathering around 3/4 of the Sphinx, around, well, not 3/4 linearly, but 3 out of 4 sides, was very, very deep, much deeper than you would expect for Old Kingdom times, much deeper than 2500 BCE. The back, though, is compatible with 2500 BCE. And we did seismic testing on other sites on the Giza Plateau in the same lithology just to confirm this. So what I had already started to hypothesize is that when the Sphinx was first carved, it emerged from the bedrock. It was only carved on 3 sides, but it was still grounded to the living rock. And I think that was very purposeful and very symbolic. And that later, when they restored and refurbished the Sphinx, they not only recarved the head, but they carved out the back fully. Everyone follow? Yeah. And I could calibrate, and I have calibrated, the depth of the weathering on the 3 sides for the original structure that we now call the Sphinx, and that puts us back at about 10,000 BCE. The one mistake I first made in the early 1990s, and my geological colleagues called me on this. When I first presented the work, remember I said it was maybe 7,000 to 5,000 BCE? And they said, a number of them came up to me privately and said, look, based on the seismic work, the depth of the weathering, subsurface, it's probably older than that. What I had done, consciously or unconsciously, was that I calibrated it essentially as if the depth of weathering would be continuous over time, versus actually, because you still have overburden, it slows down as you get deeper. Everyone follow what I'm saying? So when you take that into account and you calibrate it, I'm now convinced better, we have better models of how to calibrate it, et cetera. It does put you at about 10,000 to 11,000 BCE. It's about, let's just say 12,000 years ago, which is before the end of the last ice age, which it turns out fits with a lot of other data that I've been able to develop since, and we'll be talking about today and tomorrow. So that confirmed, that seismic work really confirmed the age of the Sphinx. I would not be talking about this right now if it were only based on the surface erosion and weathering. But having these other lines of evidence, I feel more confident than I ever have that it's absolutely correct, the dating. And as I mentioned, the rump was carved out later. This is what I'm showing here. This is actually a 1990 or so photograph. And interestingly, when you look at what's happening in the sky on the vernal equinox, circa 10,000 BCE, it's right on the slide, that is the age of Leo. And vernal equinox, looking out from the Sphinx, you see what? Leo. And Leo rising above the Giza Plateau actually looks like it's rising with its rump sort of attached initially. Does everyone see what I mean? I'm not going to make too much of that, but I think it's sort of interesting that maybe that's the case. But we'll come back to what the Sphinx was. Originally, I thought it was a lion, but I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. Something else that we found, and I was not looking for this, and it was sort of an embarrassment, as I'll point out in the next slide. This is a map of the Sphinx, looking down on the Sphinx. Does everyone see the outline of its paws and head on the right side? Yeah, everyone see what I'm talking about? These are the two paws. This is the head. This is the back of the Sphinx. So we were able to not just look at subsurface weathering, but we were able to model cavities under the Sphinx, which we were not expecting to find, but we found a major cavity under the left paw of the Sphinx. When I say left paw, I'm talking of the Sphinx. If you face the Sphinx, it's on the right side, which is actually significant. We found what looks like, okay, that's labeled as anomaly A. Anomaly B, do you see there's two Bs there? That's sort of a collapsed tunnel, sort of along the body of the Sphinx, more to the southern side. And then there's anomaly C, which is another cavity. Interestingly, the Egyptologists on the ground in Egypt, we showed them the data. We had to share all the data after getting permission to do it. And they said, oh, there's nothing to this. We already know about the cavity behind the rump. And sure enough, they knew that there was a cavity there. We had found it, not knowing it was there. Then they look at, under the left paw, there's a chamber. And I call it a chamber specifically because looking at this detailed seismic data, it's very regular. I have no doubt that it's artificial. It may have started as a natural cavity, but it's clear it's been evidently cut into an artificial chamber. But they looked at that and they said, oh, there's nothing there. We know there's nothing there. Sort of strange that we could get right on the rump area, but 60, 70 meters away, all of a sudden our equipment wasn't working properly, or who knows what. But I think there was other agendas here. I didn't know about it at the time, but you've heard of this guy? Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce, who I want to point out was passed away before I was born. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, he decades earlier had described how there was a chamber. He said there was a chamber, a hall of records from Atlantis. It would be found near or under the paws of the Great Sphinx, according to one interpretation, under the right paw. But I think he's talking about the right paw when you face the Sphinx. And this is from a children's book that my wife, Katie, put together. In fact, she was just talking about before lunch to some of the children. He predicted this. I found it. DeBecky, John Anthony Weston, I found it. This is me sitting, actually I've spoken to the ARE, the Edgar Cayce Foundation. This is Edgar Cayce's desk. I had the opportunity to actually visit and see it, which was sort of fun. And we located this seismically, what apparently he had predicted. But this was very embarrassing to me because I didn't know about this prediction. And then the way I found out is one of Edgar Cayce's sons, whose name I forget now, he's no longer alive, but this was back in 1992 or so, one or two. I get a phone call in my office. And we had shared phones back then. Another colleague said, oh, the phone's for you. And so I pick it up, and it's one of Edgar Cayce's sons, and he says, you just confirmed one of my father's predictions about, a chamber, a hall of records, an archive under the Sphinx. And I was very polite and said, oh, yes, that's interesting. I've heard of Edgar Cayce. What am I thinking? This is absolutely the last thing I need. I'm already being attacked for the age of the Sphinx, and sure enough, all of a sudden, the Egyptologists and classical historians are saying, oh, he just went there because he's an Edgar Cayce fanatic, and he wanted to find the chamber that Edgar Cayce predicted, which was not the truth at all. This is a stela of Tutmosis IV. This ties in with it. You can see me there for scale on the left. Notice on the stela, can you see it, the two sphinxes? And you see how they're sort of sitting, here we go, sitting above a structure? Well, I think that structure is underground. That is a representation, if we'll call it, of the chamber or hall of records or whatever you want to call it. And how do you get in? I've had so many people tell me, oh, that's the doorway. No, it's not the doorway. This is a stela that was erected in 1400 BCE. There's like an hour worth of stories just about that. But the bottom line is that Tutmosis IV restored the Sphinx. He says on the stela that it had been restored earlier. The name of Khafra from 2500 BC is listed, or fragment of it is listed, or was listed, because it's flaked away since. And the Egyptologists said, well, that proves that Khafra carved the Sphinx in 2500 BCE. It can just as easily be interpreted, and I think more easily, more logically interpreted, that Khafra was a predecessor of Tutmosis IV, who had restored an even older Sphinx. Everyone with me? So more, I think, analysis there, but I think it shows the Sphinx sitting above an archive or a chamber, but where is the entrance to that chamber? This is something we were looking for, and I think it's hidden below or in a cliff face, because when we did seismic work, we also ran a seismic line in front of the Sphinx and the Sphinx temple on what is sand, and we found under the sand is this incredible cliff face, and I suspect, by working hypothesis, that the entrance to that chamber is in the cliff face and then goes through the bedrock to the chamber under the Sphinx. So that's where I suspect it is, if we're going to find it. And why was this Sphinx attributed to Khafra? I'll run through this very quickly. We have what's known as the Valley Temple. If you go into the Valley Temple, you see this pit. In this pit, this statue was found. And this is a statue that is ostensibly Khafra because it has his cartouche on it. Now, I do want to mention, because I'll talk about this statue more tomorrow in another context, just because in Egypt a cartouche of a pharaoh is on a building or statue, does that mean it originated with them? Not necessarily, because we have, even the Egyptologists agree, we have many incidents where pharaohs would come along and claim something that was not really theirs, that came from an earlier period. They'd recarve their name, they'd recarve parts of it. But be that as it may, let's just assume for a second, this is Khafra, there's Khafra, there he is, there's Khafra and the Sphinx. From day one, I thought that, when day one going to Egypt, I thought that these do not look alike. Furthermore, the head is not the original head anyway, so even if it was Khafra, it wouldn't prove anything about Khafra carving the Sphinx. But what am I? I'm just a geologist. I mean, literally, people have said to me, Egyptologists, oh, you're just a dumb geologist. You can't tell faces. No, I'm serious. I mean, you know, that's off the record, but they've said that to me. So something that John Anthony West was keen on was to get someone that really knew faces. So he's unfortunately deceased now, but this is Frank Domingo, Detective Frank Domingo, who did forensic work for the New York Police Department. He went out, he analyzed the Sphinx compared to the face of Khafra, and our Khafra is also known as Chevron, so that's why it says Chevron there. This is from Mystery of the Sphinx, documentary that we all ended up doing and came out on NBC in 1993. He compared the face, he did all kinds of detailed analysis, I'm just showing you a couple, and came to the conclusion that no, they are not the same face. It's not the same person. They were both excellent artists, and they knew what they were doing, but they're not the same person. Not to sound politically incorrect, but they're not even the same ethnicity. So very, very different. It turns out that a lot of Egyptologists, all these decades later, have now come to that same conclusion. So I'm making some inroads into it. The head of the Sphinx is too small for the body anyway. Can you see that? Yeah, you compare it to other Sphinxes, they have proportions that are very, very different. Initially, we could argue or we could discuss the possibility that the Sphinx was a Sphinx and was, wrote it down and they recarved the head like a Sphinx. I don't think so. I, for a very long time, thought it was probably a lion, but a male lion. just like Leo in the sky, age of Leo and all that. But now we have evidence, and this was first developed by Dr. Manu Saifzadeh, and he and I and Robert Bauval, if you've heard of Robert Bauval, I'll come back to him later, wrote a paper on this, that the Great Sphinx, there's evidence the Great Sphinx was originally a lioness, a female lion, and maybe looking at her male counterpart in the sky at the age of Leo, but a female lion who guarded an archive. And what this comes from, and you can read this article, and there's a summary on my website, well, people don't need the www anymore, but robertschoch.com. And these are, the drawings are beautiful drawings, I think, by my wife, Catherine. She shakes her head. But they're illustrative of what we're looking at. There was a title that was used in dynastic times, which baffled Egyptologists for a very long time, because part of the title shows a lioness, you see that on the bottom left, with this rod, bent rod, sticking out of her back, and then connected to sort of a hammer or what do you call it, hatchet type thing, axe type thing. And the lioness herself looks very similar to the known hieroglyphic seen on the right for the guardian goddess Mehit or Methit. But what is going on here? And what Dr. Saifzadeh first came to hypothesize is that bent rod is not just an old bent rod, it is a key, it's physical key, and it turns out ancient dynastic Egyptians used keys that sort of looked like that, versus our modern keys. And you see this on the statue of Hemi-Unu. Hemi-Unu is important because he lived before the traditional date for the carving of the Sphinx. And if you look at his left foot, the chambers under the Sphinx is what? Left paw, front paw. Maybe that's just coincidence, but you look under his left foot. What do you see? Here you see that title. And again, here's Katie's rendition of it, so you can see it clearly. And we now translate that as overseer of the scribes of the king, because that's the inkwell and reed and whatnot. Overseers of the scribe of the king and master of the key to the lioness, or more poetically, the king's chief librarian and guardian of the royal archives of Mehit. And it turns out that Mehit was a very, very ancient goddess who guarded archives, guarded records. And what is she doing on the plateau? She is literally guarding an archive under her paws, under her left paw. And here you see from the 31st century BCE, 500-600 years before the Sphinx was supposed to have been carved, you see Mehit. You see her there with, again, a variation of the key. Does everyone see that? Variation of the key, and here's another stylized version with the chamber underneath her, and this is actually referring to the Giza Plateau. So there it is. Something that the Egyptologists had long wondered about was, why are there no inscriptions, no writings about the Sphinx? Well, they were looking for the Sphinx as we know it today. Yes, there are inscriptions, but they go back even further, and they are in the form of Mehit. So I think it all comes back together, and we, in honor of the late John Anthony West, called this the JW sign in honor of him. And it's sort of sad that John Anthony West had been looking for this type of evidence, but died before, it was fully developed. So moving on, my original dating of the Great Sphinx was to the period of 5,000 to 7,000. Now I put it at 10,000 BCE. I just want to point out that there is now a theme in Egypt, if I could put it that way, that many other structures were used and reused and built over older structures. So for instance, in this case, I want you to focus on the right side of the slide for a moment. There's something known as the Red Pyramid or the North Pyramid at Dashur. And as Doug Kenyon, a colleague, pointed out initially, and then I've followed up and analyzed it carefully, inside the Red Pyramid, one of the chambers, the last chamber, this is what you see. That is, I'm convinced, highly weathered and eroded rock. It is an older structure. Literally, this pyramid was built over it to protect it, to preserve it. Am I making sense? That's my analysis, and I'm convinced of that, having studied it numerous times now. They are memorializing and protecting an older structure. This pyramid is older than the Great Pyramid, by the classic Egyptological dating. So I think this is another structure that goes back to Zep Tepi. We have at Abydos this weird structure. You may or may not have heard of it before, but it is in a pit. It is in the ground relative to New Kingdom dynastic times. And it's made of huge megalithic blocks, most similar. And this is an old picture on the left, upper left, to show the Valley Temple associated with the Sphinx. Do you see how structurally it's very similar in style? And that Valley Temple, by my dating, goes back to about 10,000 BCE. I think that this structure probably goes back to that same period. And the fact that it's been built and covered over, and it was actually unknown to the New Kingdom Egyptians initially. They knew that there was a sacred spot or site there, which is where Seti I and then Ramesses the Great built their temple and expanded the temple, and then my hypothesis is, and it seems to be supported by the data, they ran into this structure when they were carving and they were building and digging for foundations of it. Yes, there's an even older structure there that they then revered and incorporated into their later work, 3,300, 3,400, et cetera, years ago. The Osirion's really interesting. It's the traditional, I said there, the traditional site of the tomb of Osiris's head. If you know anything about Osiris and Isis and Seth, the evil brother or half-brother murdered Osiris, cut his body up, and all the pieces were scattered. This is where the head was supposedly entombed, and then Isis collected all the pieces and brought him back to life. And, it's part of the whole cycle of Osiris. But again, Egypt is so complex. There's so many wonderful things about Egypt. But you go there, and it floods to this day, which is also indicative of its ancient history, I'm convinced, because even in New Kingdom times, this would have been flooding based on the paleohydrology of the Nile, and they pump it out sometimes. Sometimes it's empty because the Nile goes up and down in level. But you look there. Also, I wanted to point out that, have you heard of the Flower of Life? This is where the Flower of Life originates. This is the oldest version that we know of the Flower of Life. All the other flowers of life and the necklaces that people have and all that stuff, it's a wonderful symbol. This is where it originates. Goes back to a very ancient time. Another thing is the pyramids themselves on Giza. This is to give credit to Robert Bauval, my colleague. He thought that the pyramids of Giza align with what? Orion, which is Osiris for the ancient Egyptians. And they don't just align at any old time. They align around 10,500 BCE, which is, his dating on the archaeoastronomy. My dating of the Sphinx is 10,000 plus BCE. We actually wrote a book together called Origins of the Sphinx, where we put all this data together, both the data of the archaeoastronomy and of the physical geology. So my early work put it back to 5,000 to 7,000 BC. I now think it's about 10,000 BC, but even with this early work, I received no accolades from Egyptologists. The public was very different. My geological colleagues were very different. NBC did a documentary called Mystery of the Sphinx, which featured as a narrator the late Charlton Heston. And it came out on DVD. It won an Emmy. I have to mention that if you look it up on things like YouTube, you will not see the original version. Go to my website and follow various links and you'll get to an archival version maybe. But, it's been re-edited and supplemented. This is what happens to things. The one to really see is the original, our NBC version. And it upset a lot of people and rewriting history, and there were all these headlines. And interestingly, I first announced this in 1991 at Geological Society of America, got really support from my geological colleagues, very different from the Egyptologists who were not even there, who said no, aliens had not built the pyramids. I wasn't talking about aliens or pyramids. But they were so upset that they arranged hastily, within a few months, in 1992, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a, quote, debate on the age of the Sphinx. And I thought that this was going to be a real debate. We were going to talk about evidence. We were going to go back and forth, etc. How naive was I? I'm serious. Looking back at my younger self, I was incredibly naive. I thought the Egyptologists would say, oh, this is wonderful. We've got even more things to study. We've expanded the history of Egypt. No. They were just really upset with me. And it turns out they didn't really want to debate the evidence. Remember what I said? I believe in following the evidence wherever it goes and whatever the implications are. No, they just wanted to tell me, to paraphrase one, thousands of Egyptologists have studied the Sphinx for hundreds of years, and they know exactly how old it is. Turns out even that statement is nonsense. Forget about they know how old it is. There have not been thousands of Egyptologists, much less thousands of Egyptologists studying the Sphinx for hundreds of years. I have done my research. I've done the literature research. You can count on one hand or so the number of Egyptologists who have actually studied the Sphinx in any detail whatsoever. Most Egyptologists, actually, what do they study? Do you know? They study New Kingdom or Ptolemaic because that's what is covering the surface of Egypt. And it's very interesting. But even that is questionable. Do some of those remains go back earlier? So this is from the, quote, debate, unquote. And this is from Mark Lehner, who's an Egyptologist who I am very embarrassed to say in some respects got his PhD in Egyptology from, guess where? Yale University. We did not know each other at the time. But they're two different disciplines that basically, up until now, haven't spoken to each other, I would say. And if the Sphinx, he says, and will read this quote, if the Sphinx was built by an earlier culture, where's the evidence of that civilization? Where are the pottery shards, more or less broken pieces of pottery? People during that age were hunters and gatherers. They didn't build cities. More or less, he's saying, they did not have civilization. Remember the standard paradigm I talked about? He's saying they were just hunters, gatherers. This was impossible. Also, I'll mention briefly, where are the pottery shards? First off, it's not clear they had pottery. John Anthony West used to joke that they were so sophisticated they used paper plates. But secondly, even if they had pottery, the Sphinx enclosure is very small. It's been used and reused and reused. They're not going to leave their little pottery pieces there for me to find at this point. I mean, it's been cleaned out who knows how many, literally thousands of times by different cultures, not different cultures, by different generations who have venerated and repaired it and restored it. So on the face of it, it might sound good as a soundbite, but it doesn't really make sense when you analyze it. This is younger me sitting there in sort of disgust because I knew that my evidence was solid. And the thing is, they kept saying, well, where do you find more, et cetera, et cetera? If you can't have any other evidence, well, then we're not going to look at this evidence. That's like saying, as I say to children or to my students or anyone else, if you have never seen dinosaurs before, you don't know anything about dinosaurs, and you find this big bone, oh, that's impossible. The animals couldn't be that big, and we'll just dismiss it. So, bye-bye. Then you find another one. Well, you dismiss it again. You see what I mean? If you never will recognize a first piece of evidence, you're never going to get to the second or third or fourth. And I felt that's what they were doing in part. Fortunately for me, that was 1992. By 1995, and unfortunately he is now deceased prematurely, but Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt began excavating. He was with the German Archaeological Institute, began excavating in conjunction with the Turkish government, a site known as Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, near the sea of Urfa, or Şanlıurfa. And this, interestingly, just as a side note, is a traditional home and area of the biblical patriarch Abraham, and it's in southeast Turkey. What interested me was that he was finding evidence independently of me, and that's important, going back to the 10,000 BCE range, some of it a little later by his initial dating, but what I had been calling Sphinx Age, what they were asking for just a few years earlier at the debate, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science debate. I wish I had had this evidence at that time. And incredibly sophisticated. As I said, it's in northern Mesopotamia. This is also the area that some people consider the original Eden, the biblical Eden, based on descriptions in the Bible. And his initial dating for Göbekli Tepe was even older than mine for the origins of the Sphinx. Now we have good evidence that both of them go back to before the end of the last ice age. Katie, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, and I have visited many times now, and Urfa itself is wonderful. These are the pools of Abraham. This sacred cave, which they've modernized with a sink and whatnot, and you do rituals there. It's actually very moving, very spiritual, very, very, very sacred site. I'm convinced of that. This is looking into the pools. And they find things like this. Urfa man found near the city of Urfa, or not near the cities, near Göbekli Tepe, and I'll come back to him, but this is found when they do construction projects. They often hit sites that are 12,000 years old, just as old as Göbekli Tepe. So here we have an entire modern city that's built on a medieval city, built on an ancient city from Greco-Roman times, which is built on even older structures going all the way back to the end of the last ice age. And this is a beautiful example of what people 12,000 years ago looked like, at least how they sculpted themselves. It's not simple. It's not primitive hunter-gatherers. Here I am. This is actually a new museum that they built. Here I am with him, just so you can see how big he is. He's a life-size or bigger than life-size. And Göbekli Tepe itself consists of these incredible stone circles. There's 20 or more that most of them have not yet been excavated. They've been found with geophysical techniques. But think of Stonehenge. Everyone knows Stonehenge and stone circles like that. This is the same concept going back 12,000 plus years, but they are not, with all due respect to Stonehenge, which I've had the opportunity to visit, and it's wonderful. But what do you have at Stonehenge? And I like them as a geologist, big, crude, rough monoliths. What do we have here? And I'll show you pictures of this in a few minutes. Beautifully carved stone with engravings on it, with bas-relief sculptures on them, incredibly sophisticated. This is John Anthony West and I there in 2010. I'll just say it. I wasn't going to say it, but if he looks taller than me, that's not the case. It's that I'm downslope from him. There's Katie, who took a lot of these pictures. We've been there a number of times, and it has changed over the years because it has been an active excavation site. There I am in 2010 or so. This is a new awning over it, UNESCO awning that they put over it. There I am in 2012 2020, January. It gets very cold there. It's very hot during the summer, very cold during the winter. We had the opportunity to interview Ian Hodder. Ian Hodder is from the classical school, traditional academic, held in incredibly high esteem by all other archaeologists and academics. One of the foremost archaeologists of Turkey, of Turkish sites, and for a long time was doing archaeology in Turkey very actively. He's semi-retired now and living near Istanbul and associated with the university there. But he was stunned when Göbekli Tepe was first found. This is a direct quote from him that Göbekli Tepe is, quote, unbelievably big and amazing at a ridiculously early age, that is 12,000 years ago. Huge great stones and fantastic, highly refined art. Many people think that changes everything. It overturns the whole apple cart. All our theories were wrong. And this is a wonderful quote from someone who is ensconced in academia. Very, very straightforward academic. And I give him a lot of credit for being able to say that and taking that stand, because it really does change everything. Because here you have an incredibly sophisticated site, just like the Sphinx, I'm convinced, and the associated structures, that goes back 6,000 years before the traditional date for the origins of civilization. Just a few slides. I'm going to run through these very quickly. It's changed over the years since we've been there back and forth. They first did a covering over it like this to protect it. It's very near the Syrian border, and for a long time Syria's been very unstable. You can actually, I was once there at night and I could see looked like fireworks to the south. It was explosions in Syria as fighting was going on. At one point, you were under this cover and you couldn't even see the structure. All these stones here were just to hold down the roof that they put over it so it wouldn't blow away. Since then they've removed them. But it's incredibly sophisticated with these carvings. I'm not going to go through all the carvings. It's sometimes known as a vulture stone. I'll come back to that probably next lecture. But just to give you a feel for it, it is really fantastic. It's really amazing. This is what's known as enclosure C. Do you see that little animal climbing down the pillar? That is sometimes known as the beast. Some people think it looks sort of like a lion or a lioness type animal, and it's got a little pig or boar underneath it. That is not attached to the pillar separately. That is all one piece. They planned that ahead of time. I showed pictures of this to archaeological colleagues off the record. I did this twice. And I asked them, well, if you just saw this in isolation, you found this in isolation based on the sophistication, the finesse, the carving style, etc., how old would you estimate it to be? And one said 600 BCE, one said 1000 BCE. No, this is about 10,000 BCE. So it really is sophisticated for the time. It would fool the standard archaeologists if they just found it in isolation. More slides, more pictures. Some of them are anthropomorphic. If you look at that, and I'll come back to this, it has arms and hands and a little beast under the arm, sort of like holding your dog. When we flew here, we saw many people with their pets or service animals or whatever, and they carry them like that. Stylized, just to give you a sense of how beautiful it is. I want to point out that these walls, do you see the walls piled up against it? Those are ancient but secondary. I will come back to that. It's a very important point. Just looking at it. So again, just to give you a sense of it, that's not me in the picture. Sometimes people think it is. And here's a pillar. They are very shallowly set into the bedrock, which is also quite amazing. They're beautiful, huge pillars carved out of limestone. I can tell you as a geologist, these pillars weigh a lot, 10, 15 tons, which doesn't seem so big if you're into megaliths that weigh 40, 50, 80 tons, 90 tons, 110 tons, like we see in other parts of the world, or even more, 1,000 tons. But to carve a pillar like that, set it so perfectly, so shallowly in bedrock, and not have it snap, not have it break, is very sophisticated. Real feat. And here's little animals carved into the bedrock base of it. We had a chance to discuss things with Dr. Schmidt. Like I said, he's now passed away, unfortunately. And he confirmed that, yeah, the stone pillars are incredibly ornately carved. Well, of course, we could see that. The largest are 10 to 15 tons or so by his estimate at the time. The central pillars, so there's these enclosures, and the central pillars, there's pairs of central pillars which tend to face south and to the east, and I'll come back to that probably tomorrow. But some of them are anthropomorphic. As you can see here, do you see how it has arms and a belt and a loincloth? So very anthropomorphic, and the site was, and this is important, intentionally covered over at the end of the last ice age. It was intentionally covered over. It was not just abandoned and left to the wind and rain and filled in by natural elements. It was intentional. Some people have argued recently about that. I looked at the geology very carefully. I am convinced it was intentionally buried. Notice the long, thin arms, the slender fingers that point to the navel, and below that, the belt hanging down, et cetera, et cetera. They continue to excavate at Göbekli Tepe. They're finding more and more things. Just to show you a few pictures of this. And not only do they find, of course, the big pillars, but all kinds of other things. So for instance, little arrowheads. Now, does that look like it could be 10,000 BC by standard archaeological dating? Say yes. 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 I mean, yeah. Big deal. But I am giving a PowerPoint. When I started at Boston University, I used to use a chalk and blackboard. In my classrooms, do I still have chalk and blackboard? Yes, yes. Now look at this. This is in my hand. This is not my hand. That was one of the sons of the landowner at the time. This is my hand. He put this in my hand for a second. He had just found this. This is a little bead, and I don't know if you can see it there, but the little bead has a drill hole through it at a microscopic millimeter level. How do you drill that through 12,000 years ago if you don't have stone tools, if you don't have, you just have the, quote, most primitive technology? And they find thousands of these on the site. And all kinds of other interesting things, which have now been put in a big museum. So the top and the bottom right is a modern museum in Şanlıurfa. On the left, that's to show you the small museum that we first visited, where they were starting to house Göbekli Tepe relics. They know what they have. In a way, they're competing with Egypt. I don't know if you've heard about Egypt with the Grand Egyptian Museum, GEM. Well, Turkey and Egypt, in a way, not that they necessarily admit it, are competing for the antiquities. Beautiful site, but then they have these dioramas, or whatever you call it, and here's Göbekli Tepe man carving out one of the pillars. Does it sort of look, do they sort of look crude and primitive? Well, they're workmen, right? They're working away at it. But I feel like they're dumbing it down. They're trying to stick to that hunter-gatherer thing. Oh, these were just hunter-gatherers. Versus they have on display in his own room, beautifully lit Urfa man that I showed you. This is, on the right, is how they depicted themselves. On the left is how modern people are depicting them in the museum. They also have a reconstruction of the and what's known as Conclosure D, which if you look at this and you look at the real site is so much more sophisticated than the museum reconstruction. They have on display various things that have been found, artifacts that have been found at Göbekli Tepe. The one on the left is sometimes referred to as a totem pole, with good reason. These are pictures of the totem pole from the old museum when you could actually walk around it, see it from all the sides. It is beautifully carved, but it is a little broken. Do you see on the left-hand side how the face is broken out? It turns out, and this is not an isolated situation with Göbekli Tepe, it turns out this was embedded in a wall and was quite evidently older and reused and maybe kept as a sacred artifact, that type of thing, 12,000 years ago. So this, in my assessment, is even older than the core portion of Göbekli Tepe. Everyone follow what I'm saying? They were reusing, and before he passed away, before he died, tragically, Carl Schmidt came to the same conclusion. Some of the pillars, for instance, are weathered and show signs that they were being reused 12,000 years ago, just like a museum today where you have older things that you still venerate and reuse. And remember I was talking about Egypt and how they were reusing older things? And building like with the Red Pyramid or the North Pyramid around an older structure, you see the same thing here. I just think some of these are so cute. I don't know, you can agree or disagree on the left. Doesn't he sort of cute like he's begging or something? A little pig, look. How can you not love that? And some of them are anthropomorphic. This is two views of a statue of a he's about that tall, statue of a human. They could carve humans if they wanted to. And there I am again with Urfaman to remind you about that. So here we have a situation where we have, with no doubt in my mind now, two sites, and I could name more, but they're less definitive, should we say. I think these two sites are really definitive that both the origins of the Great Sphinx and other material in Egypt, if I could put it that way, sites in Egypt now that we're finding, like the Sirion is one possibility, but certainly the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple associated with the Sphinx, and then what's also known as the Mortuary Temple, portion of the Mortuary Temple that's just up the plateau from the Sphinx. I didn't even get into that. Actually, I'll mention it briefly tomorrow in my follow-up lecture. We have evidence of what I call an earlier cycle of civilization, one that was before the end of the last ice age. The ice age ends, and this is a very important date, which I will focus on tomorrow in my follow-up lecture, 9700 BCE. That is the end of the last ice age. Incredible climatic changes, incredible floods, sea level rises, etc., and it decimated civilization that existed at that time, including the original builders or carvers of the Sphinx, the original builders of Göbekli Tepe. The two views you see are the Sphinx on the left and Göbekli Tepe on the right. And there was a 6,000-year gap, which I'll focus on tomorrow, between that cycle of civilization and our cycle of civilization, which began around 4,000 to 3,000 BCE, with not the origins of civilization, but the re-emergence of civilization after essentially a dark age. So this ties in with the concept of Zep Tepi. Remember, I start with the concept of Zep Tepi. It ties in with the concept of Atlantis, of a high civilization that existed and was destroyed in a day and night, according to the Platonic accounts, the Plato's accounts that he got from Solon. And Plato talked about world ages, a golden age. When did Plato date Atlantis to? He actually is very specific about the date. Anyone know? 9,000 years before Solon. Solon was about 600 BCE. Solon was a famous Greek who some people argue was actually related, or Plato was related to Solon. But he had gone to Egypt. He had picked up the Atlantis legend, if we want to call it that, in Egypt. And he said, he was told it was about 9,000 years before his time. That would put it at 9,600 BCE. The dating on the ice cores is 9,700 BCE, and the sediment cores for the end of the last ice age. I'm talking now as a straightforward geologist. Within a century, I will give that to Plato. I think he is basically dead on. My interpretation of Atlantis is it's talking about ancient civilization. I am not one of those people who's looking for the site of Atlantis geographically. I'm looking for Atlantis in time, in the timeline. And I think that's where it is at the end of the last ice age. The Yuga cycle, people have heard about the Yuga cycle? This ties in. Where are we in the Yuga cycle right now? People argue about that. I think we're in the Kali Yuga. Many people say, oh, we're ascending and we're out of it. I'm not sure about that. But the point is, and I'm not joking, I'm semi-joking, but no, I'm really not joking. The concept of a golden age, silver age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. We have that in the Greeks. We have essentially the equivalent in the Yuga cycle, and yes, I'm aware that different people date the Yuga cycle differently, some in thousands of years or tens of thousands of years, some even millions of years. That's an open question that we can discuss at another time. But the point is that there's a concept of cycles of civilization. The Maya, did they also have that? Yes. So we have that around the world. So we have these cycles of civilization, and what we have at the end, and going back to Göbekli Tepe, is all these traditions tend to talk, like Atlantis, about the cycle of civilization coming to an end catastrophically, and we have physical evidence of that at Göbekli Tepe. So this is enclosure C, and if you look at enclosure C, do you see how this pillar, everyone see that pillar there? That was knocked down and that was re-erected hastily. Can you see that? Re-erected hastily. These crude walls were put up at the end of the last ice age. We have radiocarbon dating that dates them virtually precisely to 9700 BCE. At the end of the last ice age, we have isotope data that shows it was being destroyed just at the end of the Younger Dryas, more or less the end of the last ice age. We look at something like this. Do you see that boar sticking his little face out? He wasn't carved to just have a crude wall put up against him. That was done at the catastrophe when these pillars were being knocked down and then hastily re-erected. Look at the pillar there. Do you see it on sort of the left back? Here's a close-up. Do you see how it was literally hastily re-erected? And what I mentioned to you before is that the whole site was what? Intentionally buried. Now, just switching to Egypt for a second, we are finding Catherine Ulysses, my wife, first noticed that many sites in Egypt seem to be buried purposefully too. There they used mud brick rather than stone and other debris, so maybe this is a tradition around the world. This is at Karnak in particular, but you see it at a number of sites. And this is also Karnak, an archival site. She recently gave a talk on this, if you're interested, on what we're calling the ancient and intentional burial of Egypt. Ancient and intentional burial of Egypt in a similar fashion to Göbekli Tepe. And hypothesis, she gave this at Cosmic Summit in 2020, this year, 2025. And it was just posted yesterday on the Cosmic Summit YouTube. So if you'd like to see her presentation on that, which does not overlap with this one at all, separate topic, but ties in complements, should we say. Go to YouTube, you can see that. It was literally just posted yesterday. So why were they intentionally burying the sites? Why would you intentionally bury your site? Klaus Schmidt said, and he published this too, that in his opinion, intentional burial, and they spent as much time and energy, or maybe even more, we don't know how long it took them either way, but certainly as much energy, in his estimation, it's a crude statement, to bury it as to erect it in the first place. Why would you do that? And that's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, which ties in with the end of the last ice age. And this is a copy or illustration of my book, Forgotten Civilization. If you haven't read it and you'd like to learn more about what I'm talking about today and tomorrow, I highly recommend it. And there's a clue. What's above the Sphinx's head? The sun. Many of you know that my work points to the sun, to solar activity as what ended the last ice age, what decimated these early civilizations. And that's what I'm going to talk about very explicitly and in detail in my presentation tomorrow. Just a few other things. Katie, she did a children's workshop earlier today. She did a beautiful book to bring some of these mysteries, specifically in this case the Sphinx, to a younger generation. So she wrote a book called Adriana and the Ancient Mysteries, the Great Sphinx. And this is the first of a series. It's been published in Italian, German, and now English to talk about essentially what I talked about in this lecture when it came to the Sphinx. The next book, which is written, and our friend Lisa Perkins, the artist, is working on the illustrations, is focusing on Göbekli Tepe, which will tie in with both what I talked about today and lecture tomorrow. Then just a few other things. If you'd like to go to Easter Island, and I'm going to talk about Easter Island tomorrow, so maybe this is a little premature, but I do public tours to places periodically. So go to my website. We're doing late December, early January over New Year's. Wonderful tour to Egypt, Easter Island. You'll hear this tomorrow anyway, because I have a slide of it, because I think it's nice. Katie and I were married on Easter Island, so it's very dear to our hearts. But it's just a wonderful island and ties in with a lot of the ancient mysteries, as I will talk about tomorrow. If you're interested in Egypt, I encourage you to go visit Egypt for yourself, and I will be doing a tour if you'd like to come with me in August 2027. Why August 2027? Because there's a full solar eclipse viewable from Luxor, Egypt. Totality for over 6 minutes. That will not occur in the lifetime of anyone in this tent again. I never have said about a trip that's a once-in-a-lifetime event prior to this one, because this one genuinely is once in a lifetime. So we're going to explore Egypt, and the focal point will be seeing the eclipse. But it's based around the eclipse. If you're interested in visiting Egypt, we already have, it will sell out very quickly. There's few spaces left. I'm not really pushing it because I'm worried about worried about being filled. I'm only mentioning in case you're interested in it. Already I know a number of people who are coming, some of whom have traveled with me to Egypt before, and they want to come again. And especially for the solar eclipse. I also devote a lot of time and energy, Katie and I devote a lot of time and energy to ORCUL, which stands for Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures. We are, like many not-for-profits, desperate for money. I shouldn't be so crude that way. But if you'd like to donate, we are working on a documentary called Civilization Before Civilization, which of course ties in with the things I've been talking about and we'll talk about tomorrow. And we've got a couple of trailers for it up on the Oracle website. You can go there, or you can go to my website and find the link to it if that interests you. So that is what I wanted to cover today, and I think I got in just about an hour and a half, which was what was allotted to me. So I really appreciate it. I don't know if I should show the next slide because this next slide says questions, but I do want to show it to say thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I really appreciate it, and again, I really appreciate being invited. Carrie, thank you. And I don't know if we have any time for questions. If not, I'll be happy to answer questions privately. I think so, yeah. Yeah, so no questions. No questions, but maybe tomorrow we can fit that in.